It's going to be on the web or whatever. So, and I want this to be too formal. So, you know, if you have any questions, you know, interrupt and try to make this more of a dynamic thing. So basically, so the slides, you know, of course, will be available to you after the talk, and also our we have several computer programs that we wrote, and we're going to make this available as well. So if you're interested in, you know, using our computer code, it's on Stata computer code. So and if you just email me, you know, we're going to make the code available. All we want is that you thank us and say the errors are yours. That's the only condition. So, and this project is funded by the Quebec Research Fund, and it's called Action Concertée. So it's a concerted effort between researchers and government. So every year we meet public servants, and we just talk about where we are in our research, and at the end we write a report on the main findings of our work, and that's a three-year grant. And Simon Langlois here is a professor at Laval University. He's involved. He's one of the co-researchers, and Martin here. He's the guy doing all the work, basically. So, if ever with this, if you ever want this code and all that, you have questions, he's the guy that can answer the tough questions. So, so the project basically is on inequality, and so if you most of the research, I think over the last let's say 30, 40 years, has been concentrating on income data to look at inequality. And in the last few years, there's been more and more interest of actually looking at consumption rather than income, but basically using the same measures of inequality. So basically, once I show you the measures of inequality we're using, basically they're the same as the income. So at that point, you know, at that level, the methodology is rather similar. Okay, the only difference is that, you know, rather than looking at income, we're looking at consumption data. And so why go through all this? Well, there's been some evidence that, you know, the reporting for income, especially in the lower tail of the distribution of income, is not very accurate. And there's been some evidence to show that when consumption data would be more accurate than income data in the lower tail of the distribution. And a lot of the time we're actually interested in that lower tail of the distribution if you're interested in poverty measures. So that's one reason. And the other reason is that economists, we feel that consumption is mostly is closer to well-being than income, basically. You know, for economists, what creates well-being is consumption, is what you actually consume. So that's one other reason, is that consumption might be closer to what, quote unquote, we talk about like standard of living than income. Of course, income is important because it buys the consumption, but what gives you the actual standard of living is consumption. Okay. So there's been some work, particularly by two researchers, Pendacour in Simon Fraser and Norris, who is in, maybe he's in Manitoba now. So, and so they've worked considerably with the consumption data, looking at inequality. So a lot of what we're doing is based on what they've done. But basically what we do that they don't do, we look much farther back in time, basically. So we use the whole set of consumption data from actually the first year it's available, which is 1969. So let's see. Thanks. So before, yeah, so just, you know, the structure, what we'll be looking is that we'll be looking at actually the data, which data sets we're using to do the work. And then we'll look at the actual spending categories in the data set, since we're looking at the expenditures. And then, given that we're looking at inequality, it's really important to deflate the expenditures correctly using the correct price index. Then talk about the actual sample we're using. And one thing that Norris and Pendacour stress is that most of the work that's been done before using consumption data and distributions wouldn't actually consider the rental value of housing that is owned by the people who live in the house. Okay, so there's this issue of imputing a rental value to homes of individuals who own the homes. Okay, so that's I think that's a key issue. It's a tough issue, but it's a key issue, I think, because, you know, obviously, if you say let's homeowners are people from the higher end of the distribution of income or consumption, and they own their homes, and you're not, you know, considering the value of this home, the flow of services that come from owning the home, then obviously you're going to underestimate seriously the amount of consumption or the amount of expenses they have each year. Okay, so there could be a bias that's created by the fact that you're putting a zero for the housing category for homeowners. Okay. Then I'm going to talk about the equivalent scales. Okay, basically, which you have to correct the household expenditure by the number of people in the household. So how do you do that, basically? So that you have these equivalent scales. And then we're going to describe the actual measures of inequality that we're looking at. And then we do some regression analysis, which is, you know, I would say very descriptive. It's using regression for descriptive purposes, and we've just started this work, so, you know, we're not really satisfied with the results, but basically it took like about a year and a half, you know, to actually get the data correctly. And then there's one inequality index that people use a lot, which is the Genie Index. And so basically, there's a method where you can actually show or actually estimate what's the impact of moving different type of expenditures on this Genie Index. So if you increase a certain type of expenditure, will inequality decrease or will inequality increase. So I think we're getting some nice results from that. And finally, given that we're looking at this very long time series, we're going to we also basically started what we call cohort analysis. So we have these birth cohorts that we're using a bit to look generation by generation how inequality is moving and how, for example, young families are faring today compared to young families in 1969. So, okay. And the other important thing I forgot to say is that there's coffee at 10:25. And there's a lunch as well. I don't know if you know that. So everybody stay around at noon for the lunch. Okay. Okay, so basically trace the evolution in Canada from 1969 to 2014. Of course, you know, in our analysis, we're focusing a lot on Quebec because basically we're getting the money from the Quebec government to do that. So, but in this talk, we won't try to make it, you know, as Canada-wide as possible. Okay. Okay. So basically, what we have 24 cross-sectional surveys covering a period of 45 years. Okay. And so the first wave is in 1969. Then unfortunately goes, you know, there's nothing between 69 and 78. There is, but the one that exists is only for cities. Okay, so there is a 74, Martin? Yes. So there's two data sets basically which consider consumption, and it's but only for large cities, basically. So there is a way to construct a long time series, but you have to, you know, be careful. If you do use these data sets, well, then you have to, from these other data sets, you have to exclude people that don't live in large cities, which we haven't done, but I think there's a way to look at what's happening in large cities with more data than we have here. So the original name at StatScan was called the FAMX, and so that was changed in 1997 to the Survey of Household Spending. Okay, and what's great about the Survey of Household Spending is that it's yearly data, so you have it every year. Okay? And so this data you can get out of the so this data up until 2009, it's publicly available, and from 2010 you can get it only here. So it's not publicly available. And now, so the latest is 2014. We've got the latest, yeah, 2014 is the latest data. So we're still waiting for 2015. And so there are some issues considering that you change these you know, that Statistics Canada changed a few things when they changed. So we had to sort of, you know, think about what to do there. And so we'll talk about this. So what you have, so the unit is the household. Okay, so basically the spending that's reported, some of it is for different individuals. I think for children's clothing, you have expenditures at the, you know, for children separated from the adults. But for the rest is, you know, basically household expenditure. However, for individuals, and if you're a single parent, if you have it's a couple, then you have earnings of individual in the data set. So you have the earnings of individuals, and you have also, of course, total earnings for the household. So there is some individual level data in the data set. Okay. Okay. 7 here. Okay. So you have expenditures and savings, and you have data on housing and on type of family, and you have housing characteristics. So that's important if you want to impute the rent, basically, to know which type of dwelling individuals are in. And then you have, like I was saying, you have this income, earnings, pensions, a lot more stuff, but basically. Okay. Now the huge shift in the data is in 2010. Okay. So there's a big break in the data in terms of how the data is gathered, basically. So so what happens in 2010 is that households have a diary of expenditures, basically. Before, was basically a survey question. And in 2010, people actually are given a diary that they use for, how much time is it? Between 2 weeks and a month. So during 2 weeks and a month, they record all their expenditures, okay? And so there's half the sample approximately do that, and the other half actually are asked, by the interviewer, how much have you spent during the last year? So that part looks like the surveys before 2010, okay, that particular part. However, there's few variables that you can sort of few consumption expenditure items that for which you can actually, for the whole period, use just survey question.
Basically, the problem is that when they ask a question on survey with computer supported questioning, they didn't break down the categories the same way they did in the previous years and in the diary. So we could not follow the same spending categories all over the period. So we had to basically limit ourselves to the diaries.
So you have to use, if you want to look at particular spending items from 2010 and compare them to the years before, you have to look at the diary, basically. Okay. So one thing to do is, if you're actually looking at levels of expenditures, is actually to look item by item and try to observe a break, if there's a break, for example. And we saw these breaks, for example, for leisure items, okay? There was this huge break in the data, and we have to investigate, considerably to see whether, what was going on. But for a lot of the items, it was quite smooth, the transition. But for leisure, what StatsCan call leisure expenditures, then there was this break. And working with different items, we finally got something that was much more reasonable in terms of, the overall trend. Okay. Now, and you can say the same thing for the 1996 for the 1996 break. So basically what I'd say, is that if you're looking at items in particular, so if you're looking at food expenditure, if you're looking at housing expenditure, then you might sort of say, wow, you know, this break, it's tough to resolve. What can I do to really compare my items? But for these inequality measures, we didn't really see important breaks, you know, because basically inequality measures we're looking at is measures of how people are doing one relatively to the other. Okay, so maybe these different breaks in the way StatCan is working to get the data will have less impact on, you know, the relative difference between the individuals. Okay, because so I think, you know, I think there's some, I hope anyway, there's some value of using all this data to see what's going on for inequality over, you know, you know, we're looking at 45 years. And I think it's really interesting to do that. You know, if you focus on, you know, on smaller time periods, you're not sort of getting like the big picture over a long, very long period. And once you do that, then maybe you start thinking differently about the topic, or you're going to see things that surprise you and you say, okay, what's going on, and things like that. So I think there's really some value. It's lots of work, but at the end you have all this data and you can, you know, start asking questions. That's where we are now with this data. It's sort of, you know, starting to asking more I'd say interesting research questions. And the other thing is for these years after 2010, well, if you're starting to look at very specific populations, then the number of observations is much lower, okay? Because basically you have half the data set that's items that are budget diary items. So what we do basically is that after 2010, we do some aggregation of years, basically. So our data point is not yearly, but they cover maybe 2 years of data. Okay. Okay. So these are the groups, the large groups, and of course each of these groups can be, you know, sort of disaggregated, but these are the basic spending groups or expenditure groups that you find and over all the years, and these expenditure groups basically don't change much over the full period. You have education that comes in and out. When you start the SHS, the Survey of Household Spending in '96, up until 2003, there's no education of the members of the household. Okay, so that's a bit of an issue. Education is like, for many studies that try to pick up causal effects, education is like a key control variable. So, but here basically our analysis is more descriptive, and the expenditures include sales tax. Okay. So that's so what we're looking is at expenditures including sales tax.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I have a question about Philippe, I have a question about new technology and nouvelles technologies de l'information et de la communication,
yeah.
les TIC.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a major change in household consumption,
yeah.
over the whole period.
Yeah, yeah.
And my question, would it be interesting to identify specifically this, we call it in English the TIC là,
Yeah.
technologie de l'information et de la communication.
Yeah.
I mean, all kinds of expenditures on the cable, the internet, etc., etc.
Yeah, yeah. So we haven't, you know, we haven't touched that very much. So I think that's you know, again, I think what we're looking at things at a very large aggregation level. Eventually, I think we're going to start looking at more of these, you know, because like inequality in technology today at home, for example, can make a huge difference in terms of future inequality. So, I mean, your point, I think, is important in those terms, you know, and I think that can be that anyway. At the beginning of the internet and all that, that was a key issue, basically, that individuals were not connected to the a large number of families, households were not connected. So that could have long-run effects on the on inequality. Yeah.
Yesterday I went to. Is it working?
Yeah.
Okay. Hello. Okay. Okay. I was wondering. Yesterday I went to see a talk, and it was about childcare fees and where would it be in education?
Well, we show you. Yeah. We show you.
It's
actually, we put it in education.
Okay. So sometimes
there's a different child care expenses are an item in that data set.
Okay.
And for our purposes, we aggregated it with education.
Okay.
So it's always a tough call. So yeah, the next slide, I think so. Maybe okay. So we aggregated food. Basically, we put in bought from stores and restaurants, and transport include fuel, car rental fees, parking fees, insurance, and public transports. And from these, so basically from the 13 spending categories, we created 10 spending categories. What we're going to show you, and so these categories is based on work that has been done by Simon here. And so what we're going to present basically when we get to the results is inequality measures that use these categories here. So the basic exclusion is we exclude spending on vehicles and sales from vehicles, because basically these are very irregular types of spending, car expenditures, and they're very large amounts, okay, and they can be very cyclical. So basically, it's kind of a way to smooth the consumption series. Yeah. No. Yeah.
Why do you think that's? I think that's important to look at.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree. We're thinking about that. Okay, so I think you know, the idea is that once, you know, we work with this category, we're going to, I guess, do robustness analysis and see, you know, if you take out all durables, for example, how does it change does it change basically our overall conclusions on these trends and what's going on? So I think your point is well taken, and certainly there has to be some kind of robustness analysis that's done with you know, taking things out and looking how if things, for example, if inequality increases faster or, you know, slower if you take these items out. Okay, but I think, you know, if you, so basically we're looking at these long-term trends. So I'd be kind of surprised that this kind of playing with the data really changes the, you know, the results. However, if you're looking at, you know, more causal analysis, trying to figure out, okay, why are things, you know, moving this way, then I think these issues can be much more important. But I'm not clear about, you know, how these changes would actually importantly change these trends I'm going to show you later, okay? Because so there was, you know, most of our analysis here is descriptive, and once I'll show some regression results, and then you'll see that things are kind of screwy in these regression results, and that's maybe because, you know, there's things we haven't thought out well, and things, you know, there's some very counterintuitive results in the regressions, and maybe that's because we haven't thought correctly about, you know, all these issues of durables and changes in the way data is gathered and things like that, you know. So it's there's some aspects, I'd say, some work in progress aspect to this whole issue, because we're learning so much as we, you know, see what's going on with this this data. Okay. Yeah. 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 I think it's called housing. Yeah. Okay. So basically, housing. There's also household operations. You know what you do. You know, maintenance and all that, and also there's rent, and that's imputed rent. Yeah. Okay, so this is the changes we make for these specific items. So as of now, the you know, the fact that we're sort of re-changing the definitions by StatScan, in terms of the if you're looking item by item, then, you know, obviously it makes a big difference, and that's one thing we'll be doing later. So as of now, you know, using these different categories has an impact on how you construct the price index. Okay, so, you know, because StatScan has these price indices that are computed for items as reported by StatScan. Okay, so if you change the categories, you need to change your price index. Okay, so that's one issue. So we'll show you a bit how we do that, you know, changing these price indices, because that's really a key issue. Although you know, I mean, it's sort of lots of work, but the preliminary result in the literature is that you know, correctly differentiating, you know, household prices across regions or provinces has a small impact on why inequality has changed. So, I mean, that's, you know, so price indices, prices are not key in the evolution of inequality. You know, maybe we'll find different things, but up until now, what the literature says about this issue is that there hasn't been an important contribution to a price differentiation, you know, across households on the overall trends in inequality. Okay, so yeah.
Could you explain more As housing is much more expensive in Vancouver and Toronto, for example, if we compare to Montreal. This is an important issue if we want to study inequalities.
I agree, but I think, you know, remember we're looking at relative inequality, so, you know, maybe maybe this issue, you know, is less important. It might be more important, for example, and for other measures, if you're looking at levels and things like that, but it might be less important in terms of if you're looking at how people are doing relatively to one to the other, you know. So that's that could be one explanation, or maybe maybe the price indices are just wrong. I mean, nobody from StatScan here? Maybe the price indices. No, but I mean, this issue of a price index is, you know, it's a very, very technical issue. And we sort of, you know, basically use these price indices without really going into the detail. But take just example computers, for example. You know, are we correctly, you know, building price indices in computers? Basically, you know, when you're my age, I mean, I worked with the first computers. So, I mean, now you have, you know, you have a computer on your phone that's about 1 million times more powerful than my first AT computer. So how do you correct for all these changes in the quality of goods, you know? Or cars, for example, you know. If you're looking at cars in the late 70s, you had these cars called Pintos and Ramblers and Gremlins, and I mean, they were, you know, pieces of junk, and they were about the same price as today, basically. So, I mean, there's some people that do work on these price indices, and we sort of do the best we can, but I think, you know, I mean, these are crucial research issues for issues, you know, like inequality and, you know, and how standard of living is changing. Martin,
to answer your question, we indirectly treat this problem by separating Canada in 5 different regions and comparing them to themselves over time. So.
See, that's why he's here. So. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So for these, so there, you know, for example, another important change is that, you know, lotteries and games of chance no longer include gains. So in the earlier data set, if you looked at that item, you know, people who won lotteries, you know, would actually declare their winning, so they're not, you know, declared there. And same thing for spending in tobacco products. So for these, they're not huge, you know, amounts, but, you know, we were forced to extrapolate, do some extrapolation for these items where we think the change is too important, that could actually, you know, introduce too much measurement error. So it was just, I mean, it's a tough call, but so we're for certain items after 2010, we're extrapolating because of the limits of the data set. Okay? So
lotteries and tobacco include in leisure.
Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Lotteries and tobacco.
Yes.
They are included in the leisure function.
No, I think just alcohol. I think. No, not alcohol. Alcohol is food.
In leisure, but tobacco has its own category, I think. Or either that or it's in leisure and the survey categories include tobacco.
Okay. So basically, you know, so we have, so again, so there's the other issue is, you know, the number of observation and what's available and things like that. So what we finally do is we aggregate provinces together because we don't have enough data within each province to, you know, compute time series for all provinces, basically. So we separated, and in the FAMX, the original data set, first data sets, there's only, you don't have provincial information. You just have regional information. So we have to aggregate over the Atlantic provinces and the prairies. So we have BC, prairies. No, we have, yeah, BC and prairies are separated, and then Ontario, Quebec, and the Atlantic provinces. Okay. So which means that you have to, sort of reweight all these price indices because you have to work with regions. So you don't have regional pricing in the data set. You have to build it yourself, basically. So basically the way we do it is by region is construct these weights, basically. So this is the expenditure for food in the region divided by total expenditure, and I mean total, which is the sum of these two items. And since we put alcohol with food, then we have to reweight this as well. Okay, and also given that there's different number of observations in each region, in each province, we have to, of course, weight the provincial price indices by the fraction of households in each province. Okay? So there's two weightings. You have to reweight for the since we change we change categories, and then you have to reweight because we aggregate, and price indices, stat cans are at the provincial level, and we're working at the regional level. Yeah.
I was wondering, what do you mean by rents? When you talk about to impute rents, what is your definition of rent?
It's what people pay for rent.
Ah, okay, just for the housing,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah, it's actually what. Yeah,
okay.
It's reported rent by people, and then we use this information to give rents to households which are owner. Because owner households have zero, so everybody that reports rent, we do a bit of constraining. We'll show you, what kind. We throw some of these people out. Yeah.
So if you're doing a regional CPI and then you're going to look at inequalities across regions,
yeah.
I mean the fundamental assumption would be that people are adjusting their consumption patterns based on the prices that they see locally.
Yeah.
So is your inequality measure in some sense going to differ across regions sort of based on the way you've constructed it, and it's more showing
that's possible,
preferences than it is?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good point.
Okay.
no, but I meant to think about that. How would I get to, actually get to that, in terms of what's the impact of the way we do all this stuff on what we're actually getting. So that's, a good point. So I guess the best way to do it is do kinds of robustness analysis and, maybe work with, work with the specific items. And we haven't done that. So, for example, you use the food item in StatScan, use the prices, regional prices with StatScan, and actually see how our reweighting is actually changing the results. That's one thing, you go about it. Great. Okay. Okay. Now the other issue is this idea that you have to have a base price index. You have to compare all these prices to a base price, okay? So, and if you look at the a base year, so our base year is 2002. So if you look at the provincial price indices in 2002, they're all 100. So for the base years, you don't have any regional variation. Okay, so we based ourselves on the work of again of Norris and Pendecourt to to have a base year where the price indices aren't the same for each province. Okay, so basically our base price index is not based on a year, it's based on the year province. Okay, so price indices here, you have 100 for Ontario in 2002. Okay, so we recalibrate all the price indices so that everything is compared to Ontario 2002. Okay, and that's kind of a tough, problem. Basically, how you do that. So basically, you have to find. So what Norris and Pendecourt did, they actually found some provincial price indices that differ per province for 2002, and that price indice that varies from one province to another is at the city level. So we have city level differences in prices in 2002, and we use these city level differences to recalibrate all our price indices so that in 2002 they're different across regions. Okay, so there's some, so it's a very strong assumption we make. We make that these relative differences that we pick out for cities will be the same at the provincial level, basically. And so we assume that these city differences, on average, reflect provincial differences. Okay, so it's that's basically the way they handle it and the way we handle it as well. Okay, so it seems, again, it's a quite a important, I would say, constraining assumptions that say what's going on relatively across provinces for prices in cities also is the same for non-city areas. Okay, but that's the only, that's the way they found. Maybe there's other ways, but it's kind of, I think it's a reasonable way of doing it. Okay. So I guess maybe it's much ado about nothing. I'm not sure, but economists are fixated to prices and income. So once we get into these issues, try to get it as best we can. Okay. So again, I won't get into the exact details, but if you're interested, as I said, our code is available to you for any of these measures. Okay, so basically we restrict individuals living in provinces. Okay, so people who live, for example, in Northwest Territories, Yukon, for example, are excluded in the data set. And there might be, I'm not sure, there might be some households, Canadian households who aren't even in Canada, but I'm not sure. Are they? No, or are they? No, just so basically so. So we choose households with 7 members or less, which is the. So I guess if you go to more households, then it might be different. There might be more than actually one household unit within the household, and it is going to be difficult to capture. So the large majority of households are in that category. And also we exclude households which have no food consumption, and total consumption has to be positive. And when we do our rent analysis, we we exclude individuals that have rents tenants with rate lower, I guess. Yeah. So I put greater, that's a mistake. We exclude individuals that have rents lower than $100 a year. Okay, so, which again excludes very few people, I guess.
It's basically because there's tenants are separated in two groups, and there's formal tenants who pay rents, and mixed tenants which may pay rents for a part of the year, or either pay in on nature with mowing the lawn and etc., and those are excluded.
Okay, so but again, I mean, when we do all these distinctions or restrictions, it covers.
Yeah. It's basically we exclude, I think, less than 2% of the population.
So these are very small restrictions. Okay, and that's a bit of the how the data looks like, and so basically, you see household heads. There's a huge change going from 1969 up to 2009, 2014, and the mean age slightly increases over the years, and you see that a pretty large majority of households own their own home or apartment, and that's been increasing over time, and also single-member households. This is Canada. Yeah. And the proportion of single-member household, that's almost doubled over the years. So. Okay, so basically, if you want to impute rent, you have to, have a model, an imputation model of the rent. Okay, and if you just, regress so this is real rent, so we have this rental price index. So if you want to impute this real amount of rent, you need a model, okay, to do the imputation. So it's a very simple model. It's a regression model where you put in these predictor variables, which will show you what we use to predict this variable. But if you do it strictly on this sample, then you're going to get a bias, okay, because what is unobserved will be probably considerably different between renters and non-renters. Okay, so there's a bias, which we call selection bias. So people select themselves as renters. So to handle this, you need a selection equation. So again, you have to model whether people are renters or owners. Okay, so you need the second equation where which determines whether people are renters or owners, basically. So basically you got this equation here, and the rule is if this equation is greater than 0, then you're a renter, and if so TI is a renter indicator. If not, so you have to estimate. So these are parameters, and you have to estimate these parameters to actually do the correction for the bias, selection bias. So these, if there's not economists in the room, these variables are quite important. Okay, they're called instrumental variables. So they're variables that affect your choice of being a renter, but doesn't affect your choice of not your choice, but doesn't affect the value of your rent. So it's kind of a kind of a tough problem, thinking, okay, what will affect the value of my rent? What will affect the fact that I'm an owner or a renter, but won't have an effect on the actual rent price that I'm facing? Okay, so we'll show you what instruments we use. Basically, we use the instruments from Norris and Pendecourt. Okay, and unfortunately, there's no test. That's one problem with instruments, is that you cannot test which variables you use. You cannot test which variables you exclude from here. So there's some a priori decisions to make when you're using instruments, okay? But that's really the only way to handle selection, okay? Okay. Now the other issue is that we won't have enough time to get in the actual details, but there's an important discussion in that paper by Norris and Pendecourt on the way to estimate this equation here, okay? And the idea is that you don't, since you're looking at inequality is dispersion, okay? And the dispersion in this data comes in basically from these unobservable items, okay? Now, if you estimate all this, assuming that the variance, I'm getting into technical issues. If you assume that the variance doesn't change, it might constrain your results, So if you assume that the variance is the same for everybody, well, variance is a dispersion measure, so maybe since you're looking at the dispersion of consumption in the population, might have an impact. So they have this very, complicated way of dealing with this idea of technically what we call heteroskedasticity, of permitting the whole operation to have the possibility that these U terms are actually heteroskedastic, okay? That the individual variance is different for each household, okay? So it's kind of a technical issue, but it makes a rather important difference whether you actually use their method or if you just use the standard method of correcting for selection, okay? So that's we'll show you the results. So the next slides are very technical and go into the actual detail of the code and all that, but we won't get, we don't have time to get into that, but we still put them in the slide, and as I said, the code is available if you want to get into these issues in your own work, okay? So so these are variables. These are the instruments. So some of these are all the instruments, or yeah. So these are the variables that do not appear in the rental equation, but do appear in the probability equation, and these are really the three most important variables, and particularly these two variables. So this is computed by province, by region. Okay, so by region, we can construct a difference in the owned and rental housing prices at the provincial level. So these are aggregate measures of the difference, and so these variables, okay, are the ones that we say, okay, these variables affect the probability that you're a renter, but will not affect the actual price of renting, okay? So because there are average differences between housing prices in rental homes and owned homes, we say that might have an impact. So this is, if this difference is high, positive, then it should reduce the probability that you're a renter, okay, and vice versa. Okay, so these are the key instruments, and basically it took a lot of work for Martin to actually get this data, because if you actually read the Norris and Pendeker paper, it's kind of at certain places you have to fill in what's going on. So we got emails a lot with these authors trying to figure out from the paper what are you actually doing and where are you getting the data and how can we construct these measures. So so you have the unemployment rate here, and is the unemployment rate in the rental equation or no? Okay, yeah. So see, that's sort of a, you know, how credible is this assumption that regional unemployment rates affect your owner status or rental status, but won't affect the actual price you're getting? Okay, so there's some difficult calls that are made here, but you know, what you can do actually is sort of see how your results change if you leave out any of these variables. See how robust your results are to the actual instruments you're using. Yeah.
With the financial crisis, what do you think that could be underestimated in this kind of way to impute that?
Well, that's a good point. You know, I mean, we sort of basically you know, when you look at the actual, I'll show you the data, you know, and in terms of consumption and inequality, you don't see much happening, you know, with the after the financial crisis compared to the U.S., for example, and that's because Canada is, you know, much more generous transfer program for families in particular, which sort of, you know, smooths out consumption patterns. And so, but I mean, we do, you know, I think your question, I think, has more to do with levels. If you're actually looking at, you know, for example, the amounts of people, the amounts of money people were spending compared to, you know, how their relative position changed in the distribution of consumption. But I will show you the results at the end, and you know, we.
Il y a peut-être une autre raison, je vais le dire en français, là, mais c'est quand on étudie la consommation, à ce moment-là, ce type de variable est moins sensible aux effets de conjoncture, parce que quand arrive une crise ou un chômage, etc., les gens puisent dans leurs épargnes ou empruntent, etc. Et ils peuvent à ce moment-là lisser la consommation. À ce moment-là.
People can use their savings as well, and they can use their credit card. Yeah. Yeah.
It's really high before the financial crisis.
We didn't actually. Yeah, we didn't look at that.
And it's probably one of the most reasons that Canadians are not so much affected by the financial consequences than US, because I mean, I think we are at like 170% of our, you know, passive.
Yeah.
Our capital.
Yeah.
Assets,
yeah. So that's a very good point, you know. So
why studying consumption is interesting if we compare with income or family income, earnings, etc.
Income is much more variable than consumption. So the other thing is that the other thing in Canada is you didn't see this aggregate decrease in housing prices. So housing prices in Canada were pretty stable compared, you know, in the U.S. some regions like Arizona, you had a 40% drop in housing prices, and in the U.S. people were leveraging, you know, their household value to, you know, and you know, in Canada it's much, you know, much more difficult to do that. So that's, you know, maybe there was less of a crunch on the Canadian credit market after the crisis than in the U.S. So, So anyway, when we get to the actual data, you see, what's going on. Okay. So these are more like, okay, so at the end you have these equations. We have all these symbols here. I won't get into that, but basically, so you have these imputed values that you get from the regression. So you regress these beta coefficients, and from the first probability equation, you get these other coefficients, which correct for the selection. And so you have a final rental equation that you get from these two equations. So you're getting, so rather than the actual rental value, you put in the expected rental value in the spending items for both groups. And then you can do some other work, which is called feasible generalized least squares, to properly weight all these regressions. Now, after 2009, unfortunately, it wasn't possible to use this imputation measure. So basically, to impute for after 2009, we use matching methods. Okay, so we compare rental households with owner households, and we try to. So if a renter lives in a house that's very similar to a non-renter, then we're going to impute the owner rent using the rent from a household that is extremely similar to the original one. Okay, so that's because we lack the variables to do the analysis.
Basically, it was a constraint put on by the SIX. They told us that we could not impute the data on all the years because of the break.
Yeah.
So we got the series in 2 and did that.
So basically, if that's for certain items, StatScan, since we're using public data sets and private, sort of master data sets or whatever, they won't permit certain types of analysis because they say it's going to be wrong. But that's their call. I mean, we can't do anything about it. I think it's the wrong call. What can I do? I can call the StatScan.
You can't release it, but you could do it here and at least be able to comment on the differences.
Okay,
so you can say, I've got the procedure done. What does it look like before and after the break?
Okay, so I could actually say what I see. That's good. Okay, we're going to do that. More work for Martin here.
Thanks.
No problem.
Okay. Okay. So, but I think, if you look at all these breaks and basically you don't see any break in the data, I mean, that's not a reason why there's not a problem, but it sort of tells you, the problem might not be as important as what people at StatCan think about it. If you're looking at levels, then that might be a much bigger problem. But we're looking at the relative difference between individuals. So these breaks might be less of a problem, than what StatCan think. So they're going to have guidelines, but they're not dictators, basically. You can, try to do some stuff which might be interesting and have some value, even if it's not Statistic Canada guidelines. Okay.
There will be another break in this year because we received yesterday an email from Statistics Canada announcing that they will abandon this survey this year because they are changing the whole thing. So they announced another break.
Bad news again. too much bad news from StatScan over the last 20 years. I mean, everything, data sets disappear. Excellent data sets, beautiful data sets like that. Survey of household spending was a great data set. And for some reason, they decided, okay, we're going to, well, anyway, that's my editorial comment. That's it. Okay, so these, for the rental characteristics, these are the key characteristics from the, the expenditure, the household spending data set. So this number of rooms and type of housing, that's key variables, in terms of predicting rent, and also household characteristics, are important variables that you'd want in the prediction equation. But these variables also appear in the probability of being a renter equation. Okay, so you have all these variables that appear in both equations, and the instruments appear only in the probability of being a renter equation. Okay. Okay, so we'll stop with this, then you can get your coffee, for those that need the coffee. So, so these are the values, the imputed values we're getting on average, the average values, okay, for the owners and the renters, and basically this looks a lot at what Norris and Pendeker are getting, is that the imputed rents for the owners are larger than the mean rent. The mean imputed rent for the owners is larger than the mean imputed rent for the renters. Okay, so, and if basically you don't do this selection probit, then the numbers look more the same. Okay, so if you don't do this selection procedure, you might underestimate the rental value for housing that is owned compared to, and the differences are, I mean, rather large. So yeah, $1,000. These are in 2002 prices. Yeah, dollars. Yeah.
But if I'm thinking of a model where I can choose to rent or own, my ownership is a form of savings. So if your model is purely dealing with consumption and you don't have a line item in there for savings, are you in a sense sort of counting part of savings for homeowners and not counting savings for renters, and is that inflating your difference between the two to some degree?
Well, that's too tough a question for me to answer.
Something to think about that.
There's an hypothesis behind the difference between owners and renters, which is usually owners will take better care of their housing, make modification they prefer, and this will give a better or more expensive spending on housing. I need to buy a better quality household, and I'm getting more services from it, and that's why the difference should be that owners pay more.
Yeah.
Okay, so
that's more, yeah. That's more like, that's more of the fact that, unobservables that determine whether you're an owner and the amount of rent you pay, those unobservables will be.
But should those kind of things should those things not be caught up in your maintenance expenditures, or is maintenance expenditures part of this?
No.
No. Okay. So some of that is.
We have maintenance expenditures, in the date.
Some of the quality differences here. Yeah. Some of the quality differences in the maintenance expenditures and the upkeep expenditures, but there's still got to be a pretty large part of that, I think, that is savings.
I mean, in that. Yeah. You're upkeeping for, to maintain the asset value.
But that's outside of this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So So I think the main answer is that we're basically not dealing at all with the saving issues. You know, we're not dealing with wealth issues. We're basically dealing with flows of consumption. Okay. Okay. Actually, there's even like a flow of a service that comes from the actually owning your home. You know, some utility coming from actually, you know, being a homeowner. Yeah. Okay, so 15-minute break and we'll come back. So it's about 10:25, I think. Yeah. Let's come back at 20 to 11.
Est-ce que vous avez essayé de faire une régression pour le groupe des propriétaires, une régression pour le groupe des locataires, puis comparer un peu les résultats?
Non.
Ça pourrait être intéressant.
Pour la consommation générale,
oui.
Non, on n'a pas fait ça.
Oui, ça pourrait être intéressant.
Ben, on peut, généralement, tu sais, ouais, mais, ils sont plus riches, oui. Donc, on va fermer. Mais... Ici.
Pour comparer avec
ethics approval through the institution.
Okay.
Not at the.
Well, okay, okay, everything's okay. You can, yeah, okay. Ça a tombé.
Comment?
Je suis complètement nul sur ces histoires-là. Ça va, parce qu'on dit qu'il est un peu loin. Ça va bon.
C'est bon?
Good. Ouais, ça c'est beaucoup. OK, thanks. Merci. Okay. Let's move.
Réseaux sociaux et
Okay, so equivalent scales. So, you know, the basic idea here is that, you know, if you have two individuals living together, they'll need less income than a single individual to attain the same standard of living. You know, so basically, if you have two people, you need less income to get to a certain standard of living for both individuals. You know, because you're sharing a lot of the goods you're buying, which so that's the basic idea. You have these what were called adult equivalents. So basically what we're saying is we compute a number of adult equivalents in the household. So basically we have to weight each individual in the household. So this one is Statistics Canada weighting of individuals in the household. So you see that the second member has a weight of 0.41. So basically we consider that a two-person household, two adult household, is equivalent to having 1.4 adults in the household. So we divide the consumption by these equivalent scales to control for the number of individuals that are in the household. And you get basically a result that's very similar if you just divide by square root of n being the number of individuals in the household. Okay? And we've done some robustness analysis to these different measures, and basically it doesn't affect, it's going to affect the level of these indices, but it doesn't affect the trend, obviously, because these different changes in equivalent scales, you know, won't make much of a difference on the trends, okay? Unless there's some huge differences in household composition, for example, you know. But over the years, basically, it's been pretty much the same in all regions in Canada. Although in Quebec, households have become smaller on average than in the rest of Canada. Okay, so basically, if you're looking at levels, and you're looking at how, you know, median income household is progressing in different regions, then, you know, in Quebec it can make a big difference how you're, and you want to compare Quebec to Ontario and things like that. Then your results might be, you know, considerably different depending on the scale you're using, because there's been a reduction in household size that's more considerable in Quebec due probably to, especially in the 80s, 90s, the divorce rates were much higher, whatever, dissolution rates of couples were much higher in Quebec than in the rest of Canada. But that's sort of, converge in all regions. Not converge, but if you look at Ontario and BC now, I don't think the dissolution rates of couples is very much different from in Quebec. But I haven't, I used to do lots of demographics in the 90s, and it's fun stuff, but I'm not too sure of what I'm saying right now, so just put a grain of salt on it. But I think, these marital patterns and having children outside of marriages, I mean, Quebec was way different than all other provinces, but now there's sort of a convergence in divorce rates and marriage rates and common law marriages and things like that. Okay. So basically, this is pretty much standard. These what we'll be looking at. So we're looking at these Genie coefficients. So most of them are, except the last one, these are more like relative inequality measures. Okay, so how people are doing relative to each other. Okay, so for example, you can have two countries which are on average very different in terms of mean income, but you can get the same Gini coefficient, for example. Okay, so there's basically it's looking at the relative position of individuals in the distribution. Okay, and these Gini coefficients, they consider the whole population. So when computing the Gini, you're using all the data, basically. But then people in the last years have looked a lot at these percentile ratios, looking, okay, what's the ratio of the 90th percentile compared to the 10th percentile, or the 50th percentile compared to the 10th, or 90th compared to the 50th. Okay, so we'll be looking at that as well. And we're looking at OECD poverty thresholds. The dispersion of the log of expenditures. Then there's this Palma index, which may be not as well known. And one poverty measure that's maybe more of an absolute type is this measure based on the basket of goods. Okay, that was introduced in 2002 by StatScan. Okay, so we have these slides where we actually give you the formulas and we give you the state of commands that actually compute these numbers. And so again, you see, so here, this measure, this Genie index, is computed with the sum of all consumption in the population, and basically it's a measure of how the share of income, is the share of consumption. Different groups that are ranked by the amount of consumption they're having, and so basically, if one person is consuming everything, then it's going to be 1, and if everybody's consuming the same thing, it's going to be 0. Okay, so anytime you're moving towards 1, it means that there's this measure of relative inequality is increasing. Now, these percentile ratios basically is just, okay, so you compute the median, so what's the the value of the median household, and you divide it by the household that's the 10th percentile. Okay, but always, you know, corrected for the scale. Okay, so basically these are so you have the median household expenditure scaled for the number of individuals in the family. So everything here is scaled for the number of individuals in the family. Okay, so OECD poverty threshold, that's the proportion of households with expenditures that are below 50% of median expenditures. Okay, so this is different from the StatScan. It's quite close, you know, if you look at the thresholds. So again, you see it's a relative measure of poverty because it depends on your how far you are from the median household. Okay. So if you're in a very rich country, you can be very far from the median household and still be doing pretty good, you know. So that's, in that sense, it's a relative measure. And there's the variance of log spending, which is just a measure of dispersion, basically. And then this Palma index, that's interesting. So basically, you look at the total consumption of the top 10%, and you divide it by the total consumption of the lower 40%. Okay. So it's what all the rich people are consuming compared to all, you know, lower middle class and poorer people are consuming. Okay. Okay, and this market-based measure is sort of basically I'd say what you need to achieve sort of a modest standard of living. Basically, what's the amount of money so you can actually satisfy basic needs. But that's not a relative measure. No, basic needs is basically what you need, quote unquote, not to survive, but basically to have sort of a decent standard of living, or actually, you know, having enough food, enough rent, you know, proper housing. And so this is a more, you know, complete definition of how you construct this this market-based basket. So this is more absolute. It's a bit more like the U.S. poverty threshold. And these are the values here, okay, for the threshold, depending on the size of the family. Okay. So these would be considerably lower to these OECD measures. So if you look at these inequalities, these poverty measures, they're much lower than, for example, the low-income cutoff by StatScan. Okay. So this actually, there was a report yesterday that Quebec had the lowest poverty rate using this. And it's much higher in Quebec if you use the relative measure, for example. And that's a problem. And a lot of it is due to housing, basically. Because these thresholds are Canada-wide, basically. When StatScan computes the lower income cutoff rate, it's a Canada-wide measure. So, and one of the characteristics is large cities. So basically, it's based. So one of the key components when they actually compute this income is whether you live in a large city or not. Okay, and in Quebec, like half the people live in Montreal, and housing rents are much lower in Montreal than Toronto or Vancouver, but that's not reflected in the LICO. Okay. And it's going to be reflected in this, because the provincial, so for example, Quebec, the relative measures, StatCan measures are kind of biased to increase the Quebec poverty rate. So if you correct for the fact that rents are much lower in Montreal, you'd probably get much lower poverty rates in Quebec than in the rest of Canada. Even the relative rate should be smaller if you would correct for that specific fact. Okay. Okay, so we're going to look at different groups when I'm going to show you these poverty rates and these coefficients out there. And so we're looking at households with one member, couples, a typical family, and these other households, which none of these, in this group, there's these two groups, or these three groups don't appear in the final group. Okay. Okay, so this is the okay, the results, okay, we get from for different measures of inequality. And so so you see that, and this is for the different regions, okay. There's five regions. So there's Atlantic, Quebec, Ontario, Prairies, and BC that are on this graph. And basically, you look at the trends, and there's a lot of noise there, because for example, here the sample size is pretty small, but you see that basically there's more stability for single households, although the inequality coefficients are much higher, okay, for for households with one person. Okay, so you see the Genie coefficient, the range is 25 to 35, and for households that are greater than that have children and couples, then you see that the rate at the beginning increases very rapidly, and then sort of stabilizes. There's still a slight increase, but not much compared to these years here. Okay, so, and this is pretty much standard, in terms of what we're getting for most of these measures, is that they start out pretty low, and they sort of increase rapidly until the middle of the 90s, and then they sort of stabilize. And one thing that's typical here is that there's, I think, policy-wise, people are starting to realize that this was going on. Okay, so government started to be much more proactive in terms of transferring. So, for example, the child tax benefit started in those years, approximately, and has been also increased every year, not every year, but substantially over the years. And 2 years ago was another very important increase in transfers to poor families at the federal level. Okay. And one thing that's in many cases, in the later years here, for example, Quebec is much lower, not much lower, it is lower, it's always lower than the rest of Canada. And what's typical in Quebec is that Quebec has their own transfer programs to poor families, you know, which has also increased over time. Now, the other thing that's particular is that there's nothing very specific going on, you know, if you compare the, you know, looking at the financial crisis, which we were talking, you know, earlier, that in terms of inequality, we don't see any sort of jumps, you know, that you're getting in the U.S., for example, for these measures. And so the idea is, you know, is how important are these transfers? What's the role of transfers in sort of getting a smoother consumption level for the different families, and so, and these, you know, the fact that this hasn't been moving much over the years, I think is certain in Quebec. It's become a main concern. Actually, there was a lot of talk recently about welfare, particularly for single individuals, right? Because Quebec has done a lot for families over the last 20 years, basically. A lot of programs specifically targeting families and specifically targeting poorer families. Okay? So one other thing is during this period here, okay, there was a huge change in the culture of civil servants in Canada. I mean, that's something less well known. It's more, I mean, I'm not sure how well documented it is, but in the early 2000s, there was a conference in Canada where civil servants across the country came in to talk about welfare and work, basically. And there was a convergence across all provinces in terms of what the strategy should be to address the issue of welfare across Canada. And basically, the strategy was to change from an approach where you find the optimal approach is find everything you can so that the individual doesn't get welfare. That was the basic thinking in the 80s, 90s, in terms of how to approach. And then the thinking was give them welfare, but get them back to work. So forget about, the details about should we give it to them, give more discretion to the public servants, but put in back to work programs to get welfare back to work. And so of course there's been growth in the last, in those periods, but there's been a considerable drop in people receiving, households receiving welfare across Canada. So in Quebec, the reduction is almost over 20 years, about 50%. Okay? So I'm just speculating a bit of what's going on. Now the other thing is that this pattern, okay, it looks a lot like a pattern that was seen in Great Britain. Okay, and so that's why there's a lot of credence to this this idea that these years of removing regulations in the markets, having for a more globalized world was key in getting these inequality measures to rise so much in such a short period of time. Okay. But then, I guess in some countries, if you think about the Blair era as well, there was a reaction to these policies, not in terms of deglobalizing, whatever, but certainly in terms of transferring and getting, changing work incentives for poor people, credits, tax credits for families in particular. And these things all occurred in this period, okay? And since then, things have sort of stabilized. So if you look at graphs for the Great Britain, it's quite similar. And in the U.S., this is, if you look at the same thing in the U.S., you'd have more of a trend continuing to go up. It wasn't really this flattening that you see in the measures aren't so visible. So basically, in terms of inequality, there hasn't been, for consumption anyway, there hasn't been much movement over the last 20 years. Okay, and so there's a lot of talk about the top 1%. So, which is true, whatever things. But if you look at the full population in general, then things look more stable. Okay. Now here things are pretty stable for this median to 10 percentile ratio, but if you're looking at the P90, P10 ratio, then you're getting a bit the same curvature. For singles, you get pretty much the same thing. You still get the red, which is Quebec, is generally lower than the rest of the provinces, except here, which is less clear. But you still get this sort of curved pattern, okay, where you have an increase and then a stabilization in terms of what I'd say what the quite wealthy are consuming versus what the poor are consuming. You have a question?
No, I have an observation.
Yes.
If we distinguish the typical families, we can see an increase in the variance, les différences entre types de familles. Les familles sont beaucoup plus homogènes au début de la période, 69, 82, 92, etc.
Yeah.
Mais à mesure qu'on avance dans la période, on voit une variation plus grande entre les types de familles.
Mm-hmm.
Et ça, c'est un résultat important parce que c'est un résultat qui montre que les arrangements familiaux, le fait d'avoir plus d'enfants, monoparentales, etc., crée des différences dans les inégalités. Et ça, c'est...
Yeah, across families, yeah.
Ça, c'est un résultat important, je pense.
Yeah, okay.
Et ça pose tout un défi pour les politiques familiales, les politiques publiques qui doivent maintenant tenir compte aussi des différences.
Exactly. Yeah, household composition
yes.
and what's going on. Yeah, that's clearly some big differences in terms of what's happening given different types of families. Of course, the families in the the earlier years were much more homogeneous, as you were saying, and there might be things to say in terms of you know, what was the role of, for example, higher divorce rates over this, you know, very long period, which has increased considerably. So, but you know, I think, as I'll show you, there might be a way to look at these correlations, because there is considerable, as I'll show you when we do the regressions, there's considerable provincial level data, you know, that's out there in all kinds of data sets. And you might want to use this provincial level data to pick up correlations between the provincial level data and these indices. Okay, and I'll show how we do that. You know, simple example is education. So in the data set at the provincial level, we have like 8 years where we don't observe education of the household members in the data set. Okay. But we have other data sets where we have, for example, percentage of individuals with a university degree at the provincial level. Okay. So these are possible variables that you can use in regression analysis to see how they're correlated with the, or conditionally correlated with these inequality indices. Okay, so I'll show you the results on that soon. Okay. So for the P90, P50 ratio, well, the curve is less, you know, if you compare the rich with the median, the curve is not as, you know, as steep in the beginning versus the P10, P90. So it shows that, you know, there's it was really comparing the very wealthy with the poorest that you can pick up these more strongly, these changes in inequality. And I'd say over the years there's, you know, there's been a lot of discussion. When you look at public discussions on this issue, people are looking a lot about that, how the very wealthy are doing versus how the very poor are doing. Okay. And maybe it's a more intuitive measure. This Gini coefficient is kind of, you know, okay, you have this measure. You have to look at it technically, see what's going on. These percentile ratios, it's very simple. You know, anybody can understand basically what a percentile is and what a ratio is. Anyway, most people can figure out what that's going on. So these measures are, you know, in terms of policy, in terms of presenting policy to generate discussion, these percentile ratios are interesting because of their simplicity. Okay, basically, so we have here the OECD poverty rates. Okay, so again, I mean, these poverty rates as more. There's a bit more. There's a lot more variation. There's a lot more noise in there, and it's going to be much more sensitive to the business cycle, for example. Because generally, poor people have less access to credit markets than richer people, and so basically, there's, you know, you see this again, that the red line is Quebec, so, you know, in terms of poverty rates, and in terms of inequality, generally Quebec is in the lower range. And I guess again it's due to these targeted transfer programs, specifically to families. So if you look at Quebec compared to other provinces, there's not much difference for individuals, singles, okay? But there's huge differences in terms of families, okay, and specific measures to increase the either earnings or simply the transfers of, and we'll see later how that affects another of our indices.
We've seen a lot of these. We've seen a lot of these graphs, but how big are the confidence bands around these point estimates? Are we actually saying something is different from something else, or is this just potentially?
I mean, here I'd say the bands would be pretty large because the data is sparse. Yeah, sparse. Here we maybe more, you know, a lot more data points here than here. Okay, so that's a good point. But still, whatever the ranking remains, you know.
Oh, no,
yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So I think if you look over the whole, if you take the whole, you take the mean of this and compare it to the mean of the, then you probably get a difference. Maybe if you do it year by year. What?
I have a question because if we compare Ontario and Quebec,
Ontario, right there, yeah.
Yes, is higher than Quebec.
Yeah,
so inequality and poverty are higher in Ontario than in Quebec.
Yeah.
And I was wondering why, because the immigrant population is much higher in Ontario than elsewhere in Canada.
Yeah.
Half of the immigrants.
And
probably we know that immigrants, they start at the lower, they often face difficulties, etc., etc. And I was wondering if the immigration rate is an explanation for this difference. We don't know.
So good. We will, in our regressions, we don't, I think it's not significant. Huh? Yes. Yeah, you see Quebec, you see Ontario is like. You take the, can you, Simon, can you give the microphone again?
If you look of the book that it wrote at McGill Sociology Department about the Quebec fight for poverty and social measure that Quebec take over the time, it showed that the poverty rates decrease, especially in the low-income family with child or with children. But the single, the poverty for the single member, it's super high in Quebec and it's super high in Canada in general in comparison to the OECD country, which means that we fight against poverty, but only for families with children, but we avoid to take care about the single person.
Yeah. So our result is different for single. We don't see that. For consumption, for consumption, maybe you get for income you'd see it, but for consumption you don't see it.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is the OECD measure. So as I was saying, and I was saying for certain reasons, the Canada LICO, low income cutoff, I think is biased, is upwards biased for Quebec. So in some terms, maybe the result for the LICO is reflects the bias in the Quebec for the measure for Quebec, as particularly for housing. And the other thing is that one thing like for example, Montreal, you get very high poverty rates for Montreal using the, but I mean, Montreal has 4 universities. There's thousands and thousands of students in Montreal. And basically, if, you know, generally, you're going to find that students are poorer, especially, you know, with this rent issue for students. It could be a major issue in terms of computing poverty rates for Montreal. That's always one, you know, thing I think when I see these high poverty rates in Montreal, some of it is explained by the fact we have all these universities, and that in general students have very little income. While they're students, they have higher income once they finish, but once they're students, the income is very low. Yeah.
Oui, j'ai une question. Est-ce que j'ai bien entendu que Statistique Canada a publié une mise à jour de l'ICO hier?
No.
Non? Ah, OK.
I'm not sure. You know.
Ah, parce que l'ICO est abandonné maintenant. Là.
No, but I think, you know, these long-term trends.
Oui. Mais on peut
these relative. So if you're looking at the basket, yeah. Okay, which corrects for the rental issue because these baskets are at the provincial level, well, maybe the poverty rates will be different.
Il faut comprendre que l'ICO a été mis à jour par Statistique Canada à différentes périodes. Dans les années 60, yes. Ensuite 73, 75, yeah. Et après ça, la dernière fois, c'était 92 dans ce coin-là.
Yeah.
Et par la suite, on a simplement corrigé avec l'indice du coût de la vie. Mais c'est une très mauvaise approche, on le sait. Et il faut absolument abandonner l'ICO, ça ne veut plus rien dire.
I know, I know. I mean, I agree. But you still see it a lot. I know. I mean, I think the low-income cutoff, you know, it's there. So I think maybe this measure is, you know, used all over the world, and you can compare it across countries. And things like that, and it's, you know, I think it basically intuitively is the same. Okay, you're looking at people making less than half the median, so it's I think it's a reasonable measure to look at for relative inequality.
Est-ce qu'on peut revenir en arrière avec le D9 sur P9 et P9 sur P1, P10?
Yeah, this one, yeah.
Ah, oui. Et sur 50? Ah, OK.
OK. Okay, dispersion again. If you're just looking at this dispersion, again you see this pattern, and okay. So now that's interesting. What's interesting in the Palma Index is that Quebec has shifted a lot, you know, for the Palma Index. So remember, so the Palma Index is take the sum of the consumption of the top 10% and you divide it by the sum of the consumption for the lower 40%. Okay, so this is so these percentiles are just numbers. They correspond to a specific spot in the distribution. Well, here we're looking at, you know, the sum of what people are consuming in the top of the distribution and divided by, and there, you know, this Quebec is doing more, I'd say, in the average when you compare them to the other provinces. Okay, so that means that there's things going on in the distribution where for before you'd say, okay, clearly these other measures, inequality seems to be on average much lower in Quebec, and then once you use this index, well, You see Quebec more in the center of the distribution. Okay. So so one thing that's particular about transfer programs is that they can create, when they're very generous, they can create some kind of trap for individuals that that are receiving a lot of transfers, basically. So, because once you get in that area where you receive a lot of transfers, the moment you start to get more earnings, okay? So, for example, when you're in that 40% group, if you start to make more earnings in Quebec, you're going to get heavily taxed. Okay? So there's like a, so the incentive to move out of poverty is much lower in Quebec than in the rest of Canada. Okay? Because the taxation, the effective taxation rate, so if you take all of the taxes, it's much higher in Quebec than the rest of Canada, because you can't have transfers that are high for everybody. At one point, you have to, at a certain level of earning, you have to rapidly decrease the transfer rate, because it's going to be too costly to support all these families. Okay, so there's kind of an incentive for people in that range in Quebec to actually stay in that range. So there's not much of an incentive to get out of there, because if you get out, basically you'll get less family transfers, much less, because for a single mother with who's on that minimum wage and has 2 children in Quebec, if you take everything into account, minimum wage, let's say she's full-time, maybe she's going to, and plus the transfer, she might get something like between $35,000 and $40,000 a year. If you consider all transfers, federal and provincial. Okay, so basically you double the amount of money she's making on the market. Okay, and once she gets out of that range, if she decides to work more, it's not really worth it, because she's going to get all her transfers taxed away. Okay, so that might explain why, when you're looking at this Palma measure, that as an inequality measure, Quebec might be. That's just. I mean, I'm just speculating now, because obviously when you're looking at these measures, and myself, I'm sort of a bias looking at the policy. It might be things going on in the types of markets, types of jobs, whatever. Okay, but I'm just thinking in terms of policy. Why would this index wouldn't give us the same position in ranking than these than what we were seeing, earlier? So it just says that there's lots of things going on all across the distribution. And there's a lot of different measures that you can use and generate some information in terms of what's to explain, basically. Okay. Now, okay, poverty rate based on the basket. Okay. Now again, you see quite a lot of big inter-regional differences, okay, or between regions, lots of differences. But of course, it starts here in 2002. But basically, here in Quebec, you see this increase, okay, which corresponds a bit to what you were saying in terms of poverty rates increasing for single persons, okay. But for the other cases, pretty much stability over the period, not much change in these poverty rates. Actually, there you can see there the impact of the recession. Okay, things start to increase. Okay, and in these later years, what we see with the later data, sort of maybe a stabilization of these poverty rates, and so you see that in that's the prairies, Martin. This one is no.
Yeah, I think it's more number of observation.
Okay, yeah.
That's why we don't have the families, because they just don't, and they aren't under the threshold.
Okay. But anyway, you see this again, this rather stable picture over time, except for these increases across the at the moment of the 2008-9 recession. Okay. But I'd be surprised to see these things continuing to increase in the future data sets. So just show you, this is, I mean, this is just descriptive, and there's, everything I'm going to show you with these regressions, you have to take with a grain of salt, okay? But it's just to show you, basically, once you have all these measures, how can you then use regression analysis to pick up correlations or partial correlations between the variables and these inequality indices. So you can get all these from this. Most of them we got from CanSim data. Yeah. What's the acronym? Is it CanSim? No, it must be that in English. CanSim. Okay, CanSim. Okay. These are all provincial measures that you can actually pick up per year for every year in CanSim data, and you have it at the provincial level, but we're working at the regional level, so we have to construct from the provincial levels regional level variables. And so we have average income tax rates, we have the average rate of transfers, average age of household. That's we get from the data. Yeah. So you can compute your own regional variables. And proportion of immigrants. Okay. Now, one thing to Simon's comment about immigrants is that one thing we know is that immigrants in Quebec, they do worse than in Ontario. So, in that sense, it would push down, it would increase, higher immigration in Quebec should have a positive increase on inequality, because most immigrants find it more difficult to find jobs in Quebec. Could be a language issue, and several move because of that. Okay, so but in the long, in the long run, they do better, for example, in Toronto than in Ontario than in Quebec. of course, we have the unemployment rate, proportion of individuals living in single households. Okay, and so proportion with the university degree, this we get from another data set. Okay, so this is again, is it CANSIM or? Okay, so we use slit data where you have the education of the individual. So we compute that at the provincial level, and then basically once you have all these regions, well, you can just run regressions. Basically, you can regress these coefficients, these regional inequality coefficients on all these variables, and see, you know, what's the correlation between these measures. And so all these regressions, we put in like these, starting to talk like a teenager, I must be getting tired. So you put in these year fixed effects and these regional fixed effects. Okay, so you put a dummy variable for each region, and you put a dummy variable for each year. So that's, we didn't show that, but that's interesting because you can pick up other kinds of trends and mean regional patterns in the data, okay, which will be sort of purged of all this variation that's coming from this other stuff here, okay. So as you see, what basically we're not getting these, and these are all corrected for clustering and things like that, and we get very few things that are statistically significant. But one thing that comes out pretty strong is university degree. Okay, so if your population, all things, well, it's not, I wouldn't say causal, but it seems that in provinces or in regions where the education level on average is higher, you get more inequality. Okay, and that corresponds to basically the fact that you're getting very high returns from education, and this return from education has increased a lot over the years. Okay, so what you'd hope basically is that, given these results, is that children coming from poorer neighborhoods get educated, sort of, you know, to reduce this increase in inequality coming from education. But again, I mean, this is just, you know, partial correlations, and because so for example, this result on the tax rate, if you have higher tax rates, you have higher inequality. That's obviously not causal. There's something going on there that's a bit, so I'm saying, you know, if you look at these coefficients, some things are counterintuitive, but for most of the measures, you see, when you have a large proportion of single parents, it's going to increase inequality. Okay, so this is the kind of things you can sort of do after you get all these inequality measures, is sort of trying to find correlations, which can help you sort of try to figure out what's driving this stuff in the data. But I wouldn't put any causal credence on this. You know, I wouldn't consider these coefficients as and give them a causal interpretation. Okay.
Philippe?
Yeah.
I have an hypothesis about the people living alone.
Mm-hmm.
We saw that the Quebec policies were unable to improve the situation of this specific household.
Yeah.
But my hypothesis is maybe this is the contrary, because if the state is more generous, then maybe many more people will stay alone. Mm-hmm. For example, I was visiting professor in Toronto in 2005. I asked to my students in the classroom who were living alone, and only one person raised her hand.
Okay.
She was a female. And I asked the same question to my student in Quebec, in a classroom where 50 persons were there. And half of the classroom raised their hand. So if we increase the bursary or the financial help for students, for example, maybe more of them will go outside the family.
Definitely.
And they will create a single head
I agree.
household.
Yeah, I agree.
And it was exactly my situation in my own family when my two kids were at the university and at the master degree, so they received more financial help and they went outside my home. And my home is at walking distance from the university. So, and so my kids create two single head, one-person household and with a very low income. So maybe this is an hypothesis. I don't have an answer, but maybe when the state is more generous, then we see more one-person household.
There is some evidence also that the higher benefits in Quebec increase the divorce rate, creating more of these single households, single mother households. There is some evidence of that. In the 90s, I have a paper showing that this could be part of the reason divorce rates were higher.
Increasing the financial help.
And of course, it'll have an impact also on your poverty measures, basically, because it's, I don't say, quote unquote, it's easier to be poor if you're alone, but just, in terms of how we compute all this stuff, basically. Okay, so this is what we call decomposition of genius. The idea is, again, what's going to happen to Genie if you increase different items in the consumer package? What's going to happen? And so here we, to make it maybe more manageable, we try, instead of having all these categories, we have only 5 categories. And so basically the idea is if you move any of these categories, what's going on with the inequality in consumption, And again, there's a state package that will decompose this Gini coefficient for you. So we did it year by year, and we looked at these contributions of different items in the consumer package, basically. And basically what you get, it's for food and rent, you get a negative. So basically if you increase food and consumption, so for essential goods, basically that will have a negative impact on your inequality, your Gini coefficient, while for all the other goods you get a positive place. So I guess in terms of inequality of consumption, doing stuff that deals specifically with these 2 items would be kind of a good way to go in some sense. So for example, what the US is doing, for example, for food, might be a good policy, in terms of food assistance, or anything you can do for rent also might have more of an impact on. And this is pretty stable over time, over all these years. There's not much change in terms of, so it's kind of a robust, So that's clearly one thing that you wouldn't get with income, when you were asking, what kind of things you might get differently from, using consumption. This is one thing here. Okay. Same thing for, okay, so we're sort of, I think we're getting at the end of this here. I'm almost there. Okay. I'm going to go quick. I guess you must be fed up of all these people talking to you for the last 2 days. Yeah, more this afternoon as well. So, okay, basically, so do cohort analysis. So basically, we aggregate consumption on the basis of the year of birth of the head of the household. Okay, and we aggregate. So we have these birth cohorts, 3-year birth cohorts, starting at the age of 25, and we follow them through time. Okay, so we got. So basically, if you're 25, between 25 and 28, the first year, you look 10 years later, you'll be looking at households that are 35 to 38, okay, basically. So that's another thing you can do to see how well the same type of family is doing today relative to earlier years. And so basically, here we have 4 of these cohorts. Now, of course, the earlier cohort, basically, you can follow right up to 2012, 2014, okay? So you see, so this is basically the same birth cohort moving over time. And of course, you start later cohorts. So our last one here basically starts here. So this is a bit strange. I mean, so all the other, when you basically, in terms of inequality in the specific cohort, all the other cohorts starts at a higher inequality level than this original cohort here in 1969. So this other cohort, which started in 78, and this other cohort, which 86, sorry, and this other cohort that starts in 96 starts here, okay, here, okay. They all start higher. So a household basically with the same of the same age for the household head basically is starting at a higher inequality level than in 1969. But once you get here, I mean, it's pretty stable except for this, when we started with the 2006 cohort, where the inequality is a bit, well, it's much lower, but it quickly goes back to these what you get for the other cohorts. And it's more dramatic for the P90, P10, which corresponds to pretty much of this idea that this period of 69 right up to 1990 was a period where income inequality was increasing all over the board. So even if you compare households with the same average age for the head, you also get this this jump in inequality, but then pretty much stable over the. So you start out at a certain within cohort inequality, and you're pretty much staying there, all your life. So you have this is. I'm just going to finish. Finish, and then you can. Okay, so you can do it for the Genie coefficient as well, and finally for so by region as well. Okay. So I'm going to stop there and ask. You can ask my question.
I have a remark. This is if you go back. This is the good news for the young people in the room. Go back again. Yes. This is good news for people in the room, young people, because when they start to earn the inequality, when they start having a job and earning money, the inequality is lower at the beginning
you mean
of the
here?
cycle. Yes, the last one is.
Yeah.
So
this
yes,
one here
it is
well.
much lower. So and if we compare them to previous generation, inequality at the beginning was higher.
That's just one point. That's one thing. I mean, but, it'd be interesting to have other cohorts later to see
at least for
when they
this
start.
cohort.
Yeah, they started with this data and this cohort. They started at a level that's much closer to what they were.
Because this is a well-known phenomenon, what we call the generation effect.
Yeah,
this is a well-known phenomenon. In the 90s and the year 2000, for example, people at the beginning of their active life, they were worse than previous generation. And now it's no more the case.
Yeah. And so, of course, there's these issues of these economic factors, but there's demographics as well. Like a young household today is probably quite different. So you have a much greater chance that a young household 50 years ago had more children than today. That's obvious. So this if you compare these guys here with these guys here, the average number of children will be much higher here than here.
Yes, but this is the beginning of their life, so they don't have already any kids.
Yeah, but in 69, the average age of having children was much lower. Much lower. I mean, still, probably fertility rates there were still higher than 2, I'd say, probably. I'm not sure, but, they're still pretty high. And you're looking here at, here probably. So that's one thing. Again, regression analysis can sort of figure out what's the role of these household composition factors, which might, give us a clue what's driving these numbers. Okay.
I have another comment because the last one. This illustrates also how the generation X they face difficulties at the beginning of their life, but later on they succeed to catch up.
Yeah.
This is another result of this
analysis. That's a good result for Generation X. But where are they now, Generation X? They were the 80s generation, is that, or 70s, born in 70s. So they're 95 basically in this data set.
Now they have access to political power, as we see at the municipal level here in Montreal.
It could be temporary.
We don't know.
Can you go back to your...
Yeah, definitely.
So the most interesting thing for me was that as we're just starting to debate Genie versus Palma, and it needs a more careful look, is that the nice thing about the Palma is it's behaving as it should.
Exactly.
I mean, you don't have significance for whatever reason.
Excellent point.
But if I think about trying to do a regression with the Genie coefficient, it's going the wrong way based on our priors, whereas the Palma is behaving as we'd expect.
Yeah.
Good. That needs some more thought.
Yeah. When I saw these numbers for the first time, I was saying, what's going on? So that's an excellent point. Thanks a lot. Okay. So that's it. If you, as I say, if you're interested in the codes and all that, and and we have a few papers, although they're in French now. So, but we'll definitely write some stuff in English, and I hope this gives you incentive to work with consumption data. Okay. Bon appétit. Oui, définitivement. Il va être placé sur, je pense, le site web. Je pense qu'on va le mettre sur le site web assez rapidement. Oui. Thanks for the comment.